Let's take a look at the complex fill tool. Complex fills are usually used to create larger elements, elements that are too large to be satin stitches, ones that might snag and pull out of the garment if those longer stitches were left undealt with. You can use the complex fill tool to create large areas of color. You can use it to create more complex shapes that otherwise would be difficult to divide up. Let's take a look at the complex fill tool. I'm going to open a graphics file. This file is located on local disk C in the designs folder in a subfolder called graphics. Change my files of type to all graphics. And then I'm going to scroll down and grab fills.bmp. This is one that we would use for practicing just using the complex fill tool. The complex fill tool that we're going to look at first is the complex fill input method, but it's the traditional input mode. It's located just below your main column tools. I'm going to select it by clicking on it. I'm going to zoom in here and look at this shape. So to begin with this shape, I'm going to basically trace around my element. I'm going to start with a left click. That's going to give me that straight point or triangle point. I'm going to come across the top and click at every time there's a transition. Now I'm going to hit enter to close the shape. So this is a closed shape tool. I don't have to come back up and finish the shape myself. I just hit enter and it will close that shape automatically. I then, if you look at the icon, it looks like a little hole. And on the bottom of the screen it is asking to input a hole or hit enter to input an entry point. Since the shape does not have a hole in it, I'm going to hit enter on my keyboard. It's going to change my cursor. It is now asking for my entry point. This is where I want to start the element. So I'm going to click. That's indicating my start. It's now asking for the exit point, so I'm going to click again. And these points can be anywhere inside or outside of the element, doesn't matter. If it is outside of the element, it will not jump out to exit outside of the element. It will exit on the edge wherever it is closest to your specified point. After I'm done entering my entry point and my exit point, I then have to input my stitch direction. So if you look at my icon now, it's got a little bar with dots on either side. That's my stitch direction. And I input that stitch direction simply by clicking and dragging across the form. And now this whole element is stitches. Go into 3D, see that a little bit better. Let's move over here and do that again. So I have my tool selected. I'm going to digitize around my form. I'm left clicking at every transition. If I needed to right click to create a curve, I could have done that. I'm going to backspace to undo that. I'm going to hit enter to complete the shape. It's then going to ask for a hole. I don't have a hole, so I hit enter again. Now it asks for my entry point. Where do I want it to start? Where do I want it to stop? And then it's asking for a stitch direction. So I'm going to click and drag across the form to give myself a stitch direction. So a couple of things we want to consider when dealing with stitch directions. I'm going to grab this shape. I'm going to make it a dark gray, and I'm going to drag this up so that we can take a better look at this. I'm going to take it out of 3D, select the element, and I'm going to turn on expanded points. And that is just so that you can see the needle penetrations. This is not something you need to do when you're digitizing. I just want to take a look at the needle penetrations themselves. Let's mark this up a little bit. So I'm going to grab my markup tool. And if I look at this shape, you'll notice that I have this set up so that all of these edges have a lot of needle penetrations all the way around them. And my thought process behind that is the more needle penetrations I have on the edge, the cleaner my edge will be. So let's go back to the tool. I wanted to change my stitch direction for this. And you can change the stitch direction of any of these by selecting the element and clicking on the Insert Stitch Direction tool. And that will make a blue line appear where my stitch direction is, and I can drag that around. If I had a stitch direction that was just straight across, and it's very common for a lot of new digitizers to use because it's pretty easy to start out with, you'll notice that I have a lot of needle penetrations along either side. But if I look at the top and the bottom, my needle penetrations are every stitch. If I look at my stitch length for this, my stitch length is 40 points, so I just went to properties to look at that information. So essentially every 4 millimeters it's dropping, or it's sinking a stitch, it's sinking a needle penetration. That is not going to be nearly as clean, and what can occasionally happen, if we zoom in here, what can occasionally happen is, let's grab a markup tool, let's go blue. There we go. Is on these edges, they'll be nice and clean, but on the top, you may see, I didn't draw very well, you may see some stitches that kind of start to hang out of the side a little bit, and so your edges aren't going to be quite as clean as you would perhaps like. To avoid that, you can change your stitch direction to try to maximize the needle penetrations along the edge. To do that, again, have the element selected, come back over, select the stitch direction tool, and you can click on the edge and drag it. Now when you have this tool selected, you could also click and drag across and add another stitch direction. You want to be a little careful doing that. You can really start to change the dynamics of the density when you're doing that. So I'm going to select on the end point of one of those and hit delete. In case you get extra, that's the easiest way to get rid of them. So now let me deselect so I can see those needle penetrations, and now that's going to give me much, much cleaner edges. So let's turn off those needle penetrations and look at it in 3D. I've got nice clean edges here. That's going to work well for me. Another thing that I want you guys to pay attention to is if I exit somewhere in the middle, you'll notice that it starts to look like a slightly different color on this side versus this side. What's happening is I asked the stitches to start here and exit over here, but I also gave it this very dynamic stitch direction. What it will do is it will start here and it will fill in, and then it will travel up and start filling back to try to exit over here. So if I draw through that in slow motion, it will fill in, travel up, fill back down to exit. What's happening as it comes back down is I've actually reversed the direction of the thread. That changes the twist of the thread on the machine, and that can change how light is hitting that thread, and it can actually make it look like a slightly different color. You can use that very much to your advantage when you are deciding stitch directions. You can use the same color of blue to create the waves in the ocean of Earth Day, like we digitized in a different video, and you can change the dynamics of those threads so that it definitely reflects light differently. However, in the middle of one shape, that may not be as preferred. So let's take a look at how to avoid that. If I can have my stitches push all in one direction, that may be my ideal. It may not always be something that I can achieve, but it's something that I'm always looking to do. If I move my exit point over here, I can have this fill all in one direction, and I'll keep a consistent color. The other thing that you might encounter if you're exiting in the middle is as it fills in, generally with embroidery, I don't want to have something anchored and then sew towards it. As I'm sewing towards it, it may push a ripple of material. And if I'm pushing that ripple of material, it may actually push enough material that my fill will appear to have stopped a few stitches short, like this. Couple of ways to combat that. One, give yourself some good underlay. We talk about underlay in object properties all the time and how important that is. The other thing you want to do is give yourself a nice stable backing, and that will help out with that as well. To avoid it completely, turn try to push all in one direction. So how do I decide stitch directions, and how do I decide what am I going to do? If you can come back and take a look at me, I often will take a pencil and I will hold it up against my screen and move this pencil along that screen, along the shape that I'm doing, to determine, will I meet back up with myself? Since you can't see the pencil up against my screen, I digitized one so we can hold that pencil up against the shape. So let me copy that. Let me bring it back over to what we're working on. And I will shrink that down a little bit so that we can look against the shape. So if I was digitizing this shape and I was trying to determine a stitch direction that would work well for me, I would hold this pencil up against my screen and I would move this pencil along the shape to see, is there anywhere that I'm going to cut off? And right here I might be a little concerned that I'm going to cut that edge off. I would be more concerned if I was at a more extreme angle. Here I'm definitely kind of dividing this area into two. So if I take a look at what I'm really doing over here, I've kind of trapped space. I have this space here, and then I have this space here. And that means that I'm going to have to fill those separately. So let's clear this off. If I were to change my stitch angle, one more time, got to get out of the tool. There we go. If I were to change my stitch angle to something less extreme, I could probably get through my entire design without meeting back up with myself. For shapes like this star, well, there's very little I can do. There will always be some point that I have to cut some area off and meet back up with myself. Some complex shapes, there's not really any way to avoid it. So while it's a nice thing to try, and it will definitely help you out on less complex shapes, more complex shapes, there's sometimes nothing you can do. All right, let's take a look at how to do this circle. So I'm going to grab my complex fill tool, let's grab a different color, and I'll start digitizing. I'm going to start with a left click. I'm going to go around this circle using right clicks to create those curved points. I'm going to try to avoid having or exceeding 180 degrees in any set of 3 points. I'll come around, I'll hit enter to close the shape, and now it's asking for a hole. This one does have a hole, so I'm going to go ahead and digitize that hole. Same way, start with the left click, navigate around my shape, hit enter. It's asking for another hole. It will keep asking until you hit enter without actually inputting a hole. Now I'm going to start with my entry point, my exit point, and then I'm going to put in a stitch direction. And here, there is no way to create a shape with a hole that won't meet back up with itself a little bit. So in order to avoid some of those problems we were talking about earlier where the fill might not meet back up with itself completely, I'm going to make sure that I use a very stable backing. I'm going to make sure that I have some underlay under that before I sew that out. So those are the main tools or main steps for using a traditional input method for your complex fills. Those will get you through most of your complex shapes.